Hello everyone and welcome to another lecture for international reporting. I spent a lot of time in the Middle East covering the Arab-Israeli conflict, and so it's kind of near and dear to my heart, but also confusing, frustrating, a lot of emotions. But at the heart of the problems of the Middle East is the conflict between the Arabs and the Israelis. So let's dig down into how that um, began, how it continues, and what are the factors that are involved. So it starts with the notion of Zionism. In 1896, following the appearance of anti-Semitism in Europe, Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, tried to find a political solution for the problem in his book, The Jewish State. He advocated the creation of a Jewish state in Argentina or in Palestine. The Balfour Declaration, the British had occupied the region at the end of World War I and was assigned as the mandatory power by the League of Nations on April 25th, 1920. And this essentially was a declaration that called for an independent state for Israel. So what Arthur Balfour did is he committed Britain to work towards the establishment in Palestine of a nationalist home for Jewish people in a letter to a leading Zionist, Lord Rothschild, and it became known as the Balfour Declaration. There was a partition plan, which you can see the Jewish state proposed here, Arabs here, and so what the Jews objected to is that this was disconnected, small borders here, and that they also weren't necessarily, they didn't want Jerusalem to be an international city. And so the UN recommended splitting the state into two parts, and 56% of Palestine would be given to the Jewish state and 43% to the Arab state. And in 1947, 33 countries of the UN General Assembly voted for what was called the partition. 13 voted against and 10 abstained. In 1948, the Arabs and the Israelis couldn't come to a compromise here. And so the State of Israel was proclaimed on May 14th, 1948, and the declaration came into effect the following day as the last British troops withdrew. As a result of the war, Israel took all of this territory, and the Arabs still had control of what's known as the West Bank of the Jordan River, which is here, and then Gaza, which is here. So when Israel was declared, 5 Arab armies from Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq immediately invaded Israel, but were repulsed. And the Israeli army crushed pockets of resistance. And so the Israelis won that war decisively. There were a series of conflicts. The Suez Crisis was in 1956. At the time, the president of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, declared it under the control of Egypt rather than international authorities. The British, French, and Israelis invaded the area, but the Americans sided with the Arabs in 1956 and forced the French, British, and Israelis to get out of the Suez Canal. The Six-Day War in 1967 essentially was a major victory for the Israelis. They took the Gaza Strip here, the West Bank as well, and part of the Golan Heights, which is part of Syria. In 1973, however, the Arab armies gained back part of the territories and was seen as a stalemate, if you will, at the end, but in essence became a victory for the Arabs because they were able to get some of the land back. In 1964, the Palestinians created a genuinely independent organization when Yasser Arafat took over as the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization. and he took control in 1969 after the failure of the Arab armies in 1967. I spent a lot of time with Arafat, interviewed him a number of times. He was an interesting man. He remained single for much of his life. He said he was married to the revolution. He spoke some English. He had a problem in terms of trying to keep all of the coalition of the Palestine Liberation Organization going in the same direction. And as a result of that, he was often arguing and trying to obtain what had already been on the table before and rejected. And so he was always fighting a battle for what the last agreement was. And by that time, the current agreement wasn't as generous. But he survived, led the Palestinians through for a long time, and was the leader in the face of the PLO for many years. The first part was to get recognition for the Palestinian issue, and this is where terrorism was used as a tactic by the Palestinians to essentially say that we're going to write our name in blood. So there were various PLO factions and other militant Palestinian groups launched a series of attacks on Israel and other targets in the 1970s. The most famous probably was that when an attack took place at the Munich Olympics in 1972, in which 11 Israeli athletes were killed. Arafat did try to turn that recognition into a platform, and in 1974 he appeared before the United Nations. He did pursue the armed struggle to liberate all of Palestine. He condemned what he called the Zionist project, but his speech was a watershed in the Palestinian search for international recognition of their cause. As he said during the speech, "Today I have come bearing an olive branch and a freedom fighter's gun. Do not let the olive branch fall from my hand." But it took a long time, and he didn't succeed in many of his desires for the Palestinians before he died in the early 2000s. In 1979, there was an Arab-Israeli accord, the Camp David Accords, but it essentially was a separate peace between Israel and Egypt. And so it didn't bring about the type of peace that both Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Menachem Begin had hoped. Sadat was assassinated by what became the foundation of Al-Qaeda. They were members of the military. They were opposed to the separate peace that Sadat had achieved. I was expelled by Anwar Sadat about 3 weeks before he was assassinated because I had been interviewing some of the opponents of his agreement, and they didn't like my reporting. And it took me 30 years to be able to go back to Egypt because I was on a blacklist. After the assassination of Anwar Sadat and during the 1980s, the Palestinian Intifada occurred. There were several iterations of this. And what happened is that the Palestinians inside the State of Israel and on the West Bank and Gaza essentially took to the streets in form of civil disobedience and general strikes, and essentially trying to goad the Israelis into killing them. And the Israeli Defense Forces responded. There was a heavy loss of life, and more than 1,000 died in clashes that lasted up until 1993. Now, just before this, the Palestinian liberation movement, the Palestine liberation movement, had moved into Lebanon and taken control of areas in Lebanon, and the Israelis came in and pushed the Palestinians out of Lebanon, where they had launched a number of attacks and had their headquarters, and forced them to move to Tunisia in northern Africa. So it was seen as a reformation of the Palestinians to say the terrorist attacks are external leadership in Lebanon haven't been working, so let's take to the streets. That ultimately led to the Oslo peace process in where Yasser Arafat, Yitzhak Rabin, and Bill Clinton were involved in a step to set up a quasi-independent Palestinian state, where the Palestinians had authority over the West Bank and Gaza for civilian authority. So government functions such as roads, transportation, development, that type of thing. But the Israelis kept control of military issues. And I was there when this historic picture was taken, and there was a great deal of hope that somehow this would lead to further steps toward a Palestinian state, perhaps, and some sort of long-standing peace. But what happened is that there were some additional movements. There was a peace treaty between Israel and Jordan, and that was signed in 1994. That remains in effect technically, as does the one with Egypt. But what happened is that that all fell apart. Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a zealot. He was in 1995, and essentially what happened is that with his death, virtually stopped most of the significant peace negotiations that were going on. There were other attempts in 2000 with the prime minister at that point, Ehud Barak, who was a military man, and actually he pulled out of Lebanon. He was willing to do a deal with respect to Jerusalem and give the Palestinians partial control of Jerusalem, but essentially that fell apart. Just couldn't get everyone to cross the T's and dot the I's, and there was also a number of opponents to Barak's proposal. And so Ariel Sharon, who was a military man and a right-wing leader, essentially brought some Israelis who were opponents to the whole process and took them to the Dome of the Rock, which is a sacred place to all faiths, but there's a mosque there, and essentially provoked the government under Ehud Barak to stand down and to resign, and Sharon took power, and after that there was virtually no ability to come to a peace accord. There were some attempts. There were a two-state solution that's kind of gone the way of a variety of problems. So that the idea is that there would be an independent country in Palestine, of Palestine and Israel. They would live together, and essentially that hasn't happened. There was a Palestinian Authority, which does exist, and part of the roadmap, so that there was a prime minister, Mahmoud Abbas, also known as Abu Mazen, was selected to run this civil government in the 2000s. But then again, another important figure, Yasser Arafat, died in 2004. As I mentioned, his life was full of controversy. Many Palestinians and world leaders saw him as a good guy seeking peace, while others did not. In 2006, as you have a vacuum here of Israeli leaders who don't want to give things to the Palestinians, the death of Yasser Arafat, a certain weakness in the Palestinian Authority, the radical Hamas religious group for Palestinians in the Gaza won elections in 2006. They opposed the two-state solution. They made alliances with Iran, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, which was odd because most Palestinians are Sunni and Iran and Hezbollah are Shia. but the Hamas wanted to have coalitions outside of the traditional Sunni leaders in much of the Arab world. And even today, Hamas has control of the Gaza Strip, where there have been a number of issues and battles with Israel, and also have a great deal of power in the West Bank, um, even though the Palestinian Authority, which is primarily Sunni, still has control. So Palestinian terrorism picked up with Hamas. Many groups that wanted to destroy Israel um, um, joined with Hamas and other groups to use bombings, kidnappings, and rocket launches from Gaza, which is on the southern part. Israeli troops launched military campaigns against Hamas. The most significant one was in 2014 after it found a tunnel network for terrorist attacks and kidnappings. Israel created military posts in the Jordan Valley, which is the West Bank, created a whole series of checkpoints, built walls, and so you see that the whole process is toward peace is unraveling. So, I mean, just to give you some numbers, 700,000 refugees were forced out during the war of 1948. There are now 4 million Palestinian refugees around the world. And Israel has literally built a barrier to protect Israel's settlements on the West Bank. Jerusalem, Israel has annexed East Jerusalem, whereas the Palestinian state wants Israel as its capital. I mean, here's an interesting picture because it shows you how the geography is so tight and compact. This is what is known as the Wailing Wall, which is sacred to Judaism, okay? And right up here is what is called the Dome of the Rock. It's where Abraham is thought to have been prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac. It is believed to be the place where Muhammad ascended into heaven. It is a mosque. It's called the Dome of the Rock. And just over here is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Via Dolorosa, which is holy to Christians. So that all of this is compacted into this very small area and very difficult to get agreement among the various religions and groups to come to an agreement. Israeli settlements, here you can see the wall that has been built between Israeli settlements and Palestinian areas. 380,000 Jews occupy more than 100 official and another 100 unofficial settlements in the West Bank. There are 20,000 Jews that live on the Golan Heights, which is in the north and technically part of Syria. There are a variety of barriers, fences, and checkpoints which limit the freedom of Palestinians and also no interaction of significance between Palestinians and Jews, so that we're on a road to less peace accords and more tension. And that's been exacerbated by the fact that you have a weakened Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, a more powerful but small group of Palestinians under Hamas in Gaza, in the south, and then you have a weakened Israeli government, which has had 4 elections over the past year, and it's a variety of coalition governments, primarily led by Benjamin Netanyahu, who's had to bow to. He's conservative. He has opposed many of the peace accords, but he has some members of his coalition from the religious right, that are even more adamant about rejecting peace with the Palestinians. Now, the current coalition government does have. There's going to be a plan where Netanyahu is in power, and then he turns over power to his more left-leaning coalition partner, and so that it's a great deal of instability in an already unstable place. So that's it for now. I know it's complicated, but it's important to really keep in mind that at the center of all of the various issues in the Middle East is this battle between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So that's it for now. Thanks very much, and we'll see you online. Bye now.